In part one of the Boys of Kelvin High, we learned about the young Canadians who signed up with the Air Force and who trained at the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan here in Canada. They headed overseas to serve in one of the most dangerous occupations of the war, Bomber Command. We told about the formation of Canadian 6th Group and the innovation of the legendary Pathfinder Force. In part two, we explore how ordinary young men faced extraordinary odds in an age of electronic warfare. The inspiration for this documentary was the shocking discovery that from my high school in Winnipeg, just one high school alone, close to 50 young men were killed while serving in Bomber Command. Chris Cook, a member of Operation Legacy, continues the story of the Boys of Kelvin High.
I'm proud of the Lancaster Museum here in my hometown of Nanton, Alberta. It was quite an undertaking for such a small community to establish the only museum of its kind devoted to the efforts and sacrifices of those who served in Bomber Command. In 1985, a society was formed to save this Lancaster bomber. A few years later, the museum was built thanks to a team of dedicated volunteers, generous donations, and a keen public interest in our military history. As a member of the War Amps Champ program, I've had the opportunity to learn about war from those who were there, Canada's war amputees. Now I'm involved in Operation Legacy. Members of Champ pass on the veterans' message about the realities of war to Canada's youth. Let's look back to what the situation was like for the Allies in the early days of World War II. By 1941, Britain was isolated as the only part of Europe still holding out against Hitler. British cities had been subjected to a bombing blitz by the Luftwaffe. This was part of Hitler's plan for a cross-channel invasion of England. It was unsuccessful. The German war machine was redirected for an assault on the Soviet Union. Britain saw Bomber Command as the only way to fight back against Germany's military aggression.
It is in bombing on a scale undreamt of in the last war that we find the new weapon on which we must principally depend for the destruction of German economic life and morale.
Flying under cover of darkness, limited navigational devices, and terrible weather made it difficult for crews to locate and hit their targets. Attacks by German night fighters and anti-aircraft flak resulted in heavy casualties. By 1943, success followed for Bomber Command in the Battle of the Ruhr. Twin-engine bombers like the Hampton and Wellington were replaced by four-engine heavies, first the Stirling, then the Halifax and Lancaster. Navigational aids were developed to improve bombing accuracy. The Boys of Kelvin High follows the experiences of the young airmen serving in bomber squadrons with Canadian 6th Group and the British Royal Air Force as they continued their bombing raids while the Allies prepared for D-Day.
The sight and sound of 400 aircraft taking big trouble to Hitler and his cronies must have been a great morale booster for those on the ground. The first scary incident was when a Lancaster flying directly above us had its bomb doors open. They were going to drop them any second on our kite. I yelled, "Left, left, 5 degrees." The skipper banked away and we were clear. Our troubles were not over yet. After we had dropped our bombs and started heading back, I checked for hang-ups. Bombs that hadn't released. A 1,000-pound bomb was still secure in its carrier. It could explode upon landing. We would have to get rid of it. There was no time for that, because suddenly the mid-upper gunner yelled, "Bandit, bandit, starboard quarter up, 500 yards, corkscrew, starboard, go!" An enemy fighter was following us, and we were into our violent evasive maneuver. After what seemed like a long time, the skipper straightened out the aircraft when it was clear we had lost the fighter. Our bomb hang-up problem was still with us. The navigator advised us we had now left Germany and were over Holland. We would have to wait. I crawled along the fuselage and used the hand-operated release system. It worked, and the bomb dropped into the English Channel. It's hard to believe the luck of this crew. What a dangerous way to earn a living. But we had all volunteered.
Bombing operations over Nazi Germany challenged the ingenuity of leading experts in the use of radio and radar. Scientists from both sides worked frantically to gain an edge in a sophisticated campaign of electronic warfare.
Night navigation was one of the biggest challenges faced by Bomber Command. The early bombers carried equipment codenamed G. The navigators could track their course to the target by means of radio pulses projected from 3 ground transmitters in England.
Prior to that, for all of our trips in Wellingtons, our navigation was essentially dead reckoning. It was seat-of-the-pants sort of stuff. G was very useful because you could get pretty accurate fixes all the way through to the target and all the way back.
For raids as far as the Ruhr Valley, G was ideal. Once beyond the Ruhr, it was of no value because you were beyond its range. However, it didn't take the Germans long to figure it out, and they started to jam G, and it no longer became a real aid on operations. Where it did help was when you were coming back, and if you were in trouble, you were able to navigate quickly and accurately to one of the recovery bases on the coast where you could get down on the ground.
A more accurate radar pulse system was introduced, codenamed OBO. It was a blind bombing device used primarily in the Pathfinder's Mosquito aircraft to assist with their job of marking the targets for the main bombing force. Like G, OBO was limited by its distance to ground transmitters, so it was not useful for targets further than the Ruhr. H2S was a radar mounted beneath the aircraft. It showed the navigator an outline on a screen of the ground features below, mainly rivers, lakes, and coastlines. It was advanced technology for the times and was independent of ground stations, so distance was not a factor. Bomb aiming depended on an accurate calculation of the wind in the target area. Some bombers were designated as wind finders and were sent out ahead of the main force. They dropped target marker flares and then measured the wind speed and drift. All of this information could then be fed into the bomb site, an airborne computer which calculated the moment at which the bombs should be dropped. To counteract the devastating impact of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft flak, the British boffins devised a bit of trickery, almost too simple to fathom. This was the dropping of metal or aluminum foil strips called window from the bombers. These strips confused the German operators on the ground by jamming their radar screens with countless echoes, making 200 bombers look like 2,000. Window completely disrupted German air defenses. Bomber Command personnel developed a new vocabulary to identify the countermeasures against the enemy.
In the race for one-upmanship, German scientists were also quick to develop measures and countermeasures.
The Luftwaffe's air defenses were set up in control rooms called opera houses. From here, the Germans controlled a huge network to intercept Allied bombers and direct German night fighters. The Freya early warning radar was the first to pick up information on a possible raid. The Würzburg radar would take over from the Freya to direct anti-aircraft fire and searchlights at a closer range. The Würzburg could estimate the height of the Allied bombers. This allowed the anti-aircraft batteries to produce predicted flak, shells timed to explode in the midst of the bombers. The rate at which Allied bombers could be shot from the air was tragic. If they did manage to get through to the larger cities, such as Berlin, they had to face anti-aircraft fire from flak towers, 20 or 30 stories above the ground.
The thing that used to worry us the most was flak. And of course, we couldn't climb that high with the bomb load, not on those old Wellingtons. Some of those guns of theirs could reach you up at 10 and 11,000 feet so easily. You'd go through pieces of cloud that had been formed by bursting flak, and you'd smell the cordite as you were flying through it. You could hear it bouncing off your airframe.
The Kamm-Huber line stretched in an arc from northern France across the Low Countries and into northern Germany, shielding the Reich from bomber attacks. The line was divided into defensive cells or boxes called Himmelbett zones, containing Freya and Würzburg radars. It was a deadly system. Night fighters could engage Allied bombers all the way to the target and back to their bases in England. The Luftwaffe fitted their night fighters with the SN-2 airborne interceptor radar called Liechtenstein. Ground controllers guided the night fighters toward Allied bombers until the pilots picked them up on their radar screens. The SN-2 could cut through the interference caused by the Allies' window. Also on board the night fighters was a homing device called Naxos. It could pick up the signals from the Allied bombers' H-2S radars. The Flensburg allowed the enemy fighter to follow the Monika tail warning radar in Bomber Command aircraft. As soon as the RAF realized this, the Monika radar was stripped from Allied bombers. Under the codename Wilde Sau, or Wild Boar, Luftwaffe night fighters would fly over the flak to seek out Allied bombers, silhouetted in the glare of searchlights or lit up by the fires of the burning cities below. Another deadly form of attack was Schräge Musik, which was German slang for jazz music. A pair of oblique, upward-firing 20mm cannons were mounted on the fuselage of the Messerschmitt 110s. This allowed the night fighters to attack Bomber Command aircraft from the underbelly blind spot.
It was absolutely devastating. They would come up underneath you and pull up. If your rear gunner hadn't spotted this guy, he could sneak under you very easily.
The exploding cannon shells would set the bombers' fuel tanks on fire. If the crew bailed out quickly enough, they might escape alive. But that probability was remote. Few bombers returned from a Schräge Musik attack. One of the most terrifying experiences for bomber crews was to be coned by enemy searchlights, which swept across the sky and zeroed in on Allied aircraft.
You could always tell when you were really in trouble because the master searchlight, which was controlled by radar, had a bluish tinge, and those are the ones you worried about. Because once they hit you, then all the other searchlights would clamp on you, so you were at the peak of these 15 or 20 searchlights. The only way you could possibly fly the airplane was to literally get your head down in the cockpit and fly on instruments, because if you tried to look out, you would be blinded. Once you were coned, two things were going to happen. One, you were going to be absolutely boxed with flak or anti-aircraft fire from the German 88s, or more frightening, fighters. Because there you were, as plain as day, sitting there like a dead duck.
In March 1943, the British became aware that a remote peninsula on Germany's Baltic coast was the secret site of Hitler's long-range pilotless bombs, the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Churchill ordered Bomber Command to attack the site. Peenemunde was no ordinary target. Precision bombing would be required. The legendary Pathfinder Force was called into action. An elite, hand-picked corps of crews highly skilled in navigation. Their job was to locate and mark bombing targets for the main force. Johnny Fauquier of Ottawa was commanding officer of 405 Squadron, the Canadian 6 Group Squadron assigned to the Pathfinders. Fauquier played an important role in this raid as an assistant master bomber. Reg Lane, who would later take over from Fauquier as commanding officer of 405 Squadron, described him this way.
Johnny Fauquier was a remarkable man. I think he had ice in his veins. He was as hard as nails, and he was a tough commander who would not stand for any shortcomings in his crews.
As ever, the weather was critical. The raid had to take place in clear moonlight if the targets were to be correctly identified and hit. It would make the raid more hazardous for the air crews, but the risk had to be accepted. Close to 600 bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings took off that summer evening, including 62 from Canadian 6 Group. Peenemunde's defenses were slow to react. When the Luftwaffe fighter pilots were alerted, most of the bombing was over. The enemy fighters did manage to catch the bombers as they flew above the stream. They were easily visible in the reflection from the moonlight and the fires below. Bomber Command lost 40 aircraft that night, 12 of them from Canadian 6 Group. Did the results justify the cost? Conventional wisdom says there is little doubt that the raid on Peenemunde delayed the V-weapon attacks on London and other cities. After the raid, Johnny Fauquier went on to become group captain of 617 Squadron, the famed Dam Busters.
Bomber crews who had managed to live through the hair-raising experiences of their job were understandably superstitious. Many had their favorite good luck charms, like a Canadian coin or a stuffed animal. Some muttered prayers before takeoff, others wore pajamas under their flying suits. It was not uncommon for the tail gunner to urinate on the rear wheel before boarding his aircraft. Many crews who got through 12 sorties did not take a chance on number 13. The next op was often designated by the crew as 12A, rather than the unlucky 13.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Most airmen never thought much beyond the next op or the next leave. What was the point? Your fate was in Dame Fortune's shaky grasp. Luck played such an enormous part. It assumed a kind of form. It was a presence that flew with the crew and looked after them. At all times, it had to be humored with charms and rituals. And woe betide the man who grew uncaring.
Deliver us from evil. Amen.
How can we understand the apprehension and stress in the briefing room when the curtain was pulled aside and the young airmen saw that the target for tonight was one that was heavily defended? They knew, after a few sorties of their own, that regardless of the target, fewer aircraft would be returning. Another group of familiar faces would be missing from the breakfast table. They had got the chop, the saying went, or had gone for a Burton, a reference to the popular British ale. 30 ops was the magic number, but the dangers were the same the first time as they were on the 30th.
For those few who could not find a way to manage their fear, the prospect was a certification of LMF, or lack of moral fiber. To be certified LMF meant demotion and disgrace, and removal from flying duties. These men had volunteered and done the best they could. We came to understand what was known as the Moran principle. They'd used up their reserves of courage. For some, it was the cumulative effects of mental and physical fatigue. LMF wasn't anything we talked about or discussed. The odium attached to being labeled LMF may have compelled some men to carry on when they might otherwise have packed it in, but it had nothing to do with our resolve or that of anyone we knew.
Canadian Jack Singer was a bomb aimer with the RAF's No. 9 Squadron that operated in conjunction with the Dambusters. Singer was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for displaying the utmost fortitude, courage, and devotion to duty in numerous operations, including the sinking of the Tirpitz battleship.
Whatever the individual crew members' thoughts were, we all kept them to ourselves. It had to be that way. To talk out loud about any apprehensions one might have could only be detrimental to the overall efficiency of the crew. For myself, sometimes it took all my courage to climb back into the aircraft for startup. British Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, VC, took part in more than 100 operations over enemy territory. In talking of courage, he divided Bomber Command aircrew into two categories: men who realized that they would probably die and who forced themselves to go on, and men who, though intelligent, could shut their minds off from their imagination and carry on without foreboding of the future. Cheshire put himself in the second group. Typically, he regarded the first group as the braver. He said they had the highest type of courage.
This brings us to the actions of two Canadian Victoria Cross winners, Pilot Officer Andrew Mynarski and Squadron Leader Ian Bazalgette.
Pilot Officer Andy Mynarski of Winnipeg was a mid-upper gunner with 419 Squadron 6 Group. His Lancaster had come under fire during a raid on railway yards at Cambrai, France. It was the squadron's 13th sortie. Mynarski was preparing to bail out when he glimpsed back. His rear gunner and close friend, Flying Officer Pat Brophy, couldn't open the escape doors in his aft compartment. Mynarski plunged back through the flaming fuselage. By this time, his clothing and parachute were on fire. He continued his attempt to beat out the flames and smash open the jammed doors of the gunner's compartment. Realizing he could not help, Mynarski turned and saluted his friend. Then he jumped. French civilians rescued Mynarski, but he died of severe burns. Brophy was thrown from the plane when it crashed and was only slightly injured. He told of the bravery of his friend. Andrew Mynarski was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for outstanding courage and complete disregard for his own safety. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton named its restored Lancaster after Mynarski. It is one of only 2 flying Lancasters in the world.
Here at the Air Museum in Nanton, this Lanc is dedicated to the memory of Squadron Leader Ian Bazalgette of Calgary. He was a pilot with the Pathfinders. Bazalgette was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross following a raid on a V-1 rocket site near Paris.
Bazalgette's aircraft came under heavy anti-aircraft fire near the target. Both starboard engines were put out of action and fires broke out. In spite of this, he pressed on to the target, marking it and bombing it accurately. He then attempted to bring the burning aircraft to safety, having ordered those of the crew who were able to do so to bail out. Bazalgette chose not to escape the burning aircraft himself. He refused to leave his 2 injured crew members still on board, even though he knew the odds of crash landing safely were next to impossible. He fought desperately to control the Lancaster and did manage to land it, but the aircraft exploded, killing them all.
not enough has been said about the losses in Bomber Command. I doubt that any of us, after we'd completed 2 or 3 trips, ever felt we would live through it. I know I didn't. I didn't think we'd ever survive.
Figures on casualties are just that, figures. They give an alarming picture, but as we look at the situation so many years later, we realize that a cold statistical analysis does very little to convey the pain caused by such grievous loss. So many young Canadians, often well-educated, did not survive the war and were unable to make any further contribution to their country. The grief, sorrow, anger, and the overall effects on family and loved ones can never be measured.
Berlin was the capital city of Hitler's Third Reich. It was a major industrial and economic area, the ultimate target for Bomber Command. For Allied bomber crews, any sortie to Berlin was a nightmare. It was a long and dangerous journey across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. The horrible weather that winter was almost as dangerous as the German defenses. High winds blew bombers and target markers off course. A thick cloud cover often appeared over the targets. Many bombers fell victim to severe icing. In the face of such odds and a ghastly casualty rate, the crews of Bomber Command pressed on in the relentless drive to cause Germany's collapse.
Johnny Fauquier from Ottawa, hero of many Canadian air battles, briefed the men of the Canadian Lancaster squadrons.
Our target tonight, Berlin. If you put the same effort into this as you did into Hamburg, you'll deal the enemy a blow from which they may well find it impossible to recover. Remember, bomb aimers, the pilots are depending on you to take them right into the aiming point. Now, it's up to you, men. Good luck to you, and off you go.
In what has been officially called the Battle of Berlin, more than 9,000 sorties were dispatched to the city in 16 major raids from November 18, 1943 to March 24, 1944. The Battle of Berlin became increasingly difficult to sustain in terms of casualties. Many bombers fell victim to the German night fighters' new SN-2 radar. Berlin was also too far out of range for oboe to be effective. On those dark, cloud-covered nights, navigators had to rely on H-2S as their main navigation and bombing aid. The Luftwaffe's Schrecker music cannons were taking their toll.
On almost every trip I took, I'd count as many as 12 of our own guys going down at the same time, in flames. As you saw this going on ahead of you, you'd say to yourself, well, I'll be going into that area in about 5 minutes.
The Battle of Berlin was the toughest, most costly conflict in Bomber Command's history. Damage was inflicted on the city and its industries, and a blow had been delivered to Germany's morale. But Hitler was nowhere close to surrendering. There was worse to come.
Nuremberg, a name which still brings chills to the spines of those who survived it. With a population of about 500,000, Nuremberg was both an industrial and a political target. The city contained important engineering factories and was the setting for Hitler's infamous Nazi Party rallies. Early weather reports that morning called for favorable conditions, protective cloud for the outward trip, and clear conditions over the target. A total force of 795 bombers were sent. 118 of them were from Canadian 6 Group.
Everything went wrong from the start, and the weather was largely responsible. On the way to the target, the night sky was crystal clear. Swarming into the attack, the German night fighters had no trouble spotting the lumbering bombers. It was a massacre. Lancasters and Halifaxes tumbled out of the sky at the rate of about 1 per minute, trailing flame, blowing up, disintegrating.
The clouds that had been so desperately needed for cover on the way in suddenly materialized over the target, obscuring it. The bombing was scattered, causing minimal damage to the city. Nearly 12% of the force dispatched that night did not return. It was the biggest Bomber Command loss of the war.
War amps received thousands of letters from Canadians expressing outrage at the way Bomber Command was portrayed in The Valor and the Horror, which aired on CBC in 1992. The producer's premise? Area bombing was neither justified nor necessary. Cliff Chatterton is the chairman of the National Council of Veterans Associations in Canada. His organization filed 6 briefs with the CBC Ombudsman stating that The Valor and the Horror was a flawed, one-sided presentation that depicted Canadian airmen as murderers of civilians. In his book, The Morality of Bomber Command, Chatterton points out that the decision to adopt a policy of area bombing was based on a report of the British Cabinet. This resulted in a memorandum from Lord Charles Portal authorizing the bombing of industrial cities.
The primary objective of your operation should now be focused on the morale of the enemy civilian population, and in particular, of the industrial workers.
At the Casablanca Conference a year later, Churchill and Roosevelt approved a bombing offensive aimed at the destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system.
The aim of strategic bombing, as was repeatedly stressed in the directives, was to undermine Germany to a point at which their capacity to fight would be fatally weakened. In other words, it was to open the way for military victory.
When I look around to see how we can win the war, I see there is only one sure path, and that is an absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by very heavy bombers.
The Valor and the Horror reignited considerable debate regarding Chief Air Marshal Harris. Cliff Chatterton has been following the story of Bomber Command for many years. he has stated in his submissions that aircrew veterans, almost to a man, are unanimous in their respect for the late Sir Arthur Harris. He was a driving force and was obviously the architect of bomber raids in which many Canadians lost their lives. Notwithstanding, most aircrew realized that they were in the front line before the Allied forces landed in Europe, and that Harris was the brilliant director of the operation. Cliff Chatterton was pleased to receive a letter from Group Captain Hamish McCaddy. He was a founding crew member of the Pathfinder Force. He wrote, "My dear Cliff, I was delighted to receive your booklet, The Morality of Bomber Command in World War II, which I devoured at a single session. I shall be using it as a Bible in my future circuits with regard to the Allied bomber offensive. My most sincere personal congratulations. You have performed a great service to Bomber Command, but I consider it, more especially, a very personal salute to Sir Arthur Harris." The CBC Ombudsman's report was highly critical of the Valor and the Horror, and concluded that it was misleading, inaccurate, and failed to meet the CBC journalistic standards. In 1994, the Department of National Defense published The Crucible of War, the RCAF's official history. Terry Kopp, a well-known Canadian war historian, gave this criticism.
The authors removed the bomber offensive from the context of war and present it as a brutal, costly, and largely ineffective campaign, lacking purpose or justification. They ignore the fact that Bomber Command was the only force available to carry the war to the enemy from 1941 to 1943.
Of those aircrew who were shot down and who became prisoners of war, most would have chosen evasion if that choice had been available. But many were injured or captured immediately on coming down. They had just survived a close brush with death, and they were alone in the darkness of enemy territory.
It is understandable, after the heavy bombing raids and loss of German lives, that an airman extricating himself from a downed aircraft would be given a hostile reception by German civilians. They called the bomber crews Terrorflieger. Hermann Goering, Hitler's second in command, had been a leading ace in the German Air Force in World War I. He decreed that Allied airmen taken prisoner would be incarcerated in special camps and, immediately upon capture, would be reported to the German Air Force authorities. Goering's edict saved many lives. Unlike the Nazi SS or Gestapo, the German Luftwaffe generally followed the rules of the Geneva Convention in their treatment of prisoners. The Luftwaffe was responsible for Air Force prisoners of war in the Stalag Luft camps. This is not to say that captured airmen had an easy time. Hollywood films such as Stalag 17 and sitcoms like Hogan's Heroes gave a false picture. Food rations were inadequate, and many of the airmen suffered from malnutrition.
One of the more disturbing stories of Bomber Command concerns the 168 Allied airmen who were sent to Buchenwald prison. The story of one of these airmen, Canadian Ed Carter Edwards, serves to tell the tale. Instead of being sent to one of the Stalag Luft camps for prisoners of war, he and 167 Allied airmen including 26 Canadians, were taken to a civilian prison near Paris. There, they were mistakenly accused of being spies and saboteurs. On August 15, 1944, 10 days before the liberation of Paris, they were shipped in boxcars to the infamous Buchenwald concentration camp. They suffered from starvation, disease, and death threats. Several of the airmen, like Carter Edwards, became ill. 2 died, and all witnessed horrors that resulted in what would be called post-traumatic stress disorder in today's terms. Their harrowing experience came to an end when the German authorities realized they'd sent the airmen to the death camp in error. They were transferred to Stalag Luft 3, prisoner of war camp. As the end of the war drew near, Hitler gave the order to evacuate Stalag Luft 3. The Buchenwald survivors joined thousands of Allied prisoners on the notorious Death March as they were forced to keep on the move out of the hands of the Russians. They were liberated by the Allies in May 1945. When they returned home, the veterans of Buchenwald found it difficult to make people listen to the story of what they'd been through, or to believe it. Their champions were Canadians Art Kinnes and Ed Carter Edwards, who, along with other veterans, recounted their experiences and brought the story to light in the film The Lucky Ones and in a book called 168 Jump into Hell. These efforts led to some long-awaited recognition for the injustices the airmen suffered, and financial compensation from both the German and Canadian governments.
In April 1944, Bomber Command was placed under the control of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces in preparation for the long-awaited invasion of Hitler's Europe. Bomber Command was part of an all-out effort by the Allies to ensure the success of Operation Overlord. Bomber crews were called upon to wipe out marshalling yards, enemy airfields, coastal gun batteries, and radar stations in occupied France. They caused widespread damage to the railways around the D-Day landing area to prevent the Germans from bringing up reinforcements.
Bomber Command was more successful in attacking the small, sensitive targets in France and Belgium than anyone had ever hoped. The use of a master bomber became a standard feature of these raids, the crews of such men often becoming casualties as they remained flying over the target area throughout a raid. Much of the credit for this success also goes to the dedication shown by the bomber crews. They were delighted to be associated with the invasion and liberation of Europe.
On one raid, just before the invasion, there was another marshalling yard, Linz. We had 100 bombers on that raid. I was the master bomber. On the way back, 10 of the bombers had been shot down ahead of me, including my deputy. The target markers he was carrying exploded. He was carrying the same colors that I had, so it was no question who it was.
The assault phase for D-Day began the night of June 5th. Bomber Command sent more than 1,000 crews to attack 10 artillery batteries covering the invasion beaches. 200 crews from Canadian 6th Group took part. While the Allied armies fought their way inland, Bomber Command provided bombing support for the troops. As the enemy was driven from France, bomber crews switched back to attacking targets in Germany. Canadian 6th Group was involved in a variety of operations: area bombing, tactical strikes in support of ground forces, attacks on oil and transportation targets, and sea mining. Hitler was losing the war. Yet the enemy still managed to put up a stiff resistance. Bomber crews continued to suffer terrible losses until Germany surrendered.
We headed for briefing, wondering what trip number 30 would look like. The targets, Stettin and Königsberg, were of considerable strategic importance. The Germans were making great use of the port facilities to supply their beleaguered forces. The operation did not start under happy auspices. I saw 2 Lancasters laboring for height, flying on converging courses. They drew close and, as I watched in helpless fascination, collided and locked together. We saw no parachutes. For 14 men, the operation was already over. When we were over Stettin, the main force subjected the city to heavy attack. As our route took us back, we encountered some of the heaviest flak in our 30 operations. 38 of our bombers had been shot down. As we shut off the engines, I slumped back in my seat, too weary to move. 9 hours under constant noise, confusion, fear. The photos confirmed the success of our raid. We had completed our first tour, and I joyously let the rest of the crew know that we were being assigned to instructor duties. Our chances of living to see the end of the war had increased tremendously.
Bomber Command veterans have said how proud they were to take part in Operation Manna. After years of occupation, the people of Holland were starving. Thousands died. The Canadian ground troops had not as yet been able to liberate them. During the last 10 days of the war, Lancaster and Mosquito bombers dropped tons of bread, canned goods, and other staples to the starving citizens of Western Holland. Canadian 405 Squadron of the Pathfinders marked the targets for the food drops. Many Canadian aircrew in RAF squadrons were also part of this operation.
All of us were very happy that we could be a part of it, as we'd heard that people in Holland were, in some extreme cases, surviving on tulip bulbs and tree bark. This was our first trip to the Dutch coast in daylight. I recall we were all apprehensive because of the presence of the enemy, despite the truce that was in effect. We flew out over the North Sea fairly low and dropped down to around 500 feet over Rotterdam. We lined up and opened the bomb doors. The American force also made a large contribution to these spam and jam trips, as we called them. We all agreed it was the best raid of the war.
Younger generations today may wonder how the bomber crews did it. The mandate of Operation Legacy is to ensure that young Canadians learn the answers from those who were there. Most veterans would tell them that the bombing war was a dangerous job, but that it had to be done. It was part of a total commitment to defeat the enemy.
the bomber crews fell prey to the hazards of icing, storms, and structural failure. They perished amidst bursting shells of the flak batteries and the firepower of the enemy night fighters. Yet the crews buckled on their chutes and set out with unshakable resolution, night after night.
It was a dangerous place to fight your war, but for me and my fellow crew members, we always thought that Bomber Command was really contributing in a big way to the shortening of the war and to the saving of Allied ground forces' lives. War should be avoided if at all possible, but not at all costs. We did what we had to do to bring the war to a successful conclusion. We had to fight back, and I do not regret having done my duty.
The contribution of those who served in this long campaign should be recognized by all Canadians for what it was. Part of a difficult but necessary fight to win a war against what Winston Churchill called a monstrous tyranny.
The compulsions of 1915 and 1940 produced two of the most unbelievable manifestations of human courage and endurance in the history of war. The infantry of 1914-1918 and the bomber crews of 1939-1945.
Now you have heard the comments of Sir John Slessor. Who would be the best kind of person to say whether he is right or wrong? I'll have to put myself up as an expert, simply because I was an infantry combat soldier in the Normandy campaign. I saw a lot of war, but I could not argue with Sir John Slessor's assessment. The heroism of those who participated in the trench warfare of World War I and the bomber crews of World War II, they stand alone. It has always been a mystery to me how kids who were maybe 3 desks away from me in high school, 2 years later, could take a Lancaster bomber like this behind, look at the size of it, could take those bombers in 9-hour raids over Berlin. When we come then to the real heroes of World War II, we have to talk about those who made up Bomber Command. And in World War I, we have to talk about those soldiers who took Vimy Ridge and made Canada a nation.